Viridian, the Green Guide by My Head in the Clouds, Not Coming Down, a Boku no Hero Academia fanfic. Chapter 30. Back in Action. Izuku could hardly contain his excitement as he ran over the rooftops. Yes, logically, he knew he had technically gone out last week, but he hadn't actually been able to fight, so it didn't really count. He had gone to the beach that afternoon to practice with his slingshot, and he'd gotten a little rusty, so he should probably rely on his other weapons for now, just until his aim improved again. It hardly took any time to find a group of 4 men cornering a woman in the alley, just outside Amplifier's territory, and it took even less time to find the hero herself. She had her back to him as she walked her patrol route, so Izuku threw one of his marbles to get her attention. She looked around for a moment before she saw him, but when she did, her eyes lit up, and she immediately started running for him. Izuku was so busy wondering why she looked so happy that he didn't even have the chance to turn around and run away before she wrapped her arms around him. "Viridian," she yelled, "you're back! How are you? How's your arm? Eraser said you broke it. Are you okay?" Izuku stared at her in shock. Again, logically, he knew that Amplifier and the other heroes had missed him when he couldn't go out, but it was just so strange to actually see it. Somehow, Izuku had thought that they wouldn't really care if he came back, or that his virtual vigilantism would count as his return, so no one would really make a big deal out of it when he finally got back onto the streets. Izuku really couldn't deal with this, especially not when there were people to save. "I'm fine, but, we need to go?" To her credit, Amplifier let him go immediately to the alley he'd seen. Since he hadn't been fighting for the past month and a half, Izuku let Amplifier take the lead. He was just planning on shooting a few marbles to distract the villains and let Amplifier take care of the rest. But then he saw the smallest of the 4 villains give her the slip and start to head towards the victim, stretching his arms out like elastic to try to grab her. Izuku ran to them, grabbed his pipes, bringing one down on the villain's arm, and then started twirling the pipes to wrap his arms around it like a noodle and trap him. He earned an elastic punch to the jaw for his trouble, forcing him to release his hold on the villain as he stumbled back. Izuku lowered himself into a fighting stance since he took a moment to regroup. Thankfully, the villain had taken his attention off the victim and was fully focused on him now, but that also meant more attacks were going to be coming, and that first punch had hurt a lot more than a normal one, so the extra definitely gave punches more power. So what could he do? Well, if the quirk was like a rubber band, then there was a limit to how far his arms could stretch, and they would turn brittle in the cold. He didn't really have access to anything cold right now, but if he could find the limit. The villain reached to grab him, but Izuku dodged and started climbing up the fire escape. It was a risk, but he hadn't seen the villain use his quirk in his legs at all, so it was most likely limited to his arms, meaning that if he wanted to stop Izuku from getting away, he would have to stretch his arms to grab him. Of course, there was always the possibility that he'd think Izuku was simply no longer interested in fighting him, and he would try to fight Amplifier or hurt the victim. So Izuku would need to be prepared to get back down onto the streets quickly if that happened. He glanced down and smiled when he saw the villain reach for him. He started climbing faster. If he could get onto the rooftops, then the villain would be reaching for him blindly, and he might be able to find some way to use that to his advantage. He had to dodge the moment his feet hit the roof as the arms grabbed for him, but he kept dodging and looking around the roof as the villain continued to grope for him blindly. There was a set of vertical poles with a clothesline spread between them, and Izuku's brain immediately formed the rough semblance of a plan as he ran towards them, grabbing one of the villain's hands as he did so, dragging it along with him. As predicted, the villain immediately started to reach for him with his other hand, but Izuku was already prepared with the zip ties. The moment the second hand was in reach, he grabbed them together on the far side of the pole. Hopefully, this would hold the villain long enough for Izuku to... His eyes widened as he heard his scream coming closer to him, and he whipped his head around to see the villain flying at him, which was when he remembered that when rubber bands were stretched to their limits, they tended to snap back. Oops. There was a loud clang, and Izuku flinched as the villain hit the pole. He ran over to check on the guy, who had obviously been knocked unconscious, but he still had a pulse, so Izuku hadn't messed up too badly. He didn't know what he'd do if he killed the guy. Well, it hadn't exactly been the takedown he planned, and it wasn't the cleanest, but Izuku wasn't about to complain, as he climbed back down the fire escape. Amplifier had taken down 2 of the thugs in the time it had taken Izuku to handle 1. She was currently fighting the last guy, who seemed to be giving her a little trouble. Every time she landed the punch, the villain didn't even flinch. It was like she wasn't hitting him with any more force than a love tap. "Viridian, get out of here and get Eraser," she yelled. "This guy has some sort of shock absorption quirk." Izuku nodded and started running. The villain tried to run after him, but Amplifier got between them. He heard her getting thrown against the wall, so picked up the pace. He didn't know how long she would be able to hold against a villain like that, but as long as she focused on dodging instead of fighting, she would be able to drag the fight out long enough for him to get back. Now to get on the rooftops and find Eraser. He ended up being only a block or 2 away, thankfully. As soon as Izuku saw him, he loaded a marble into the slingshot and fired. Hopefully, Eraser would forgive him if he got a bruise. But they didn't have time for Izuku to run across 3 extra rooftops to get in range to throw the marble manually. He didn't look back as he ran back to the fight, knowing Eraser would follow him. And sure enough, by the time he could hear the sound of the fight again, he could hear Eraser falling into step beside him. "What's up, kid?" he asked. "You're in more of a hurry than usual." "Shock, absorption, amplifier, help." Apparently he was a little out of shape from his forced vacation, or else he was pushing himself way harder than he normally did, because he didn't even have enough breath to make himself intelligible. Eraser seemed to understand well enough, however, because he ran ahead, following the sounds of the fight, and Izuku saw him disappear down into the alley, with his quirk already activated. Izuku himself stopped at the edge of the roof to catch his breath, knowing that he wouldn't be much use in a fight when he was this exhausted. He would just get in the way of the heroes, which was the last thing he wanted to do. He sat down on the edge and watched what was left of the takedown, which was basically just Eraserhead, grabbing the villain with his capture weapon, then hitting his head against the wall to knock him out, which worked pretty well, now that the guy couldn't just absorb the impact. Izuku got up, stretched for a minute, before turning to go find another crime. "Viridian, wait." Izuku turned to see Eraserhead pull himself onto the roof with his capture weapon. "Shouldn't you be the one waiting for the police, Eraser?" "Ooh, I left one of the guys on another rooftop." Amplifier mentioned something about that. Eraser's mouth was hidden in his capture weapon, but he sounded amused. "She said the guy literally launched himself in the air, giving her an opening to take out one of the others." Izuku grimaced. "I really didn't mean to do that." Eraser let out a huff that sounded suspiciously like laughter. "Sure you didn't." "I was just trying to tie him up, I swear." Izuku insisted, but he was smiling now too. "It's not my fault he strayed too far trying to catch me." "Good work, problem child." Izuku's eyes widened as Eraser reached forward and rubbed his head, ruffling his hair under his hood. What? No one was ever proud of him. Well, maybe except for his mom, but even that felt like a relatively recent development. Izuku couldn't help the shocked little smile as he looked up at Eraser, who seemed as tired and as grumpy as ever, but also seemed awkward, like he was about as used to expressing pride as Izuku was to receiving it. After a second, Eraser took his hand back and sighed. "Kid, let's go somewhere where the police aren't going to try and grab you. We need to talk."